Every year, graduating medical students all over the world take some version of the Hippocratic Oath.
We enter the profession of medicine with appreciation for the opportunity to build on the scientific and humanistic achievements of the past. We also recognize the acts and systems of oppression affected in the name of medicine. We take this oath of service to begin building a future.
The oaths are all slightly different, but they're unified by one basic principle: do no harm.
But what's really weird is that medical professionals are the only ones that actually take an ethical oath. What about all the other people who have a heavy hand on the future of the species? I'm talking about the scientists working on gene editing, or cloning, or designer drugs. I'm talking about the bankers, the journalists, the mechanic, the exterminators. They've all got education and certification under their belts. But why don't they promise to do no harm?
Having them make that pledge would definitely be a paradigm shift. So today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of why all professions don't take the Hippocratic Oath. To do that, we have to ask a few questions first. Like, what exactly is harm?
Like, how can you manage a forest without harming some trees?
And do ethical oaths even work? By the end, we'll explore a path toward a world where oaths are a vital ceremony that unifies ethics and industry under a single banner. It's a world worth building for sure, so stick around and let's figure out how to make that happen.
We take this oath of service to begin building a future grounded in truth, restoration, and equity.
We're getting in deep right off the bat, because defining harm is no simple task. The word harm inherently involves two parties in an infinitely variable sea of contexts that continually morph with time and circumstance. The original oath, for instance, forbade abortions or euthanasia, but today we're much more comfortable with those things under certain contexts. In terms of science, there's been a historically lax attitude towards harm, as evidenced by everything from Mengelé's experiments on concentration camp inmates, to Japan's Unit 731, to the CDC's Tuskegee syphilis experiment. That's not even starting into the question of how to deal with environmental harms that are a standard part of doing business today. In terms of business, it's hard to imagine being able to do no harm at all. Fishing, logging, farming, they all seem to suggest that the business of being alive requires aiming for minimal harm, rather than none.
That part's especially important to remember, because if one argues that harm is something that impedes the ability of an organism to thrive as a blanket label, then it's easy to treat all of these actions as equally unethical. Other problems arise when people start to split hairs about what organisms even warrant protection. Pain is a clear marker of harm, but subjects have to be considered fully human-like in order for this protection to actually apply to them. It's why there's still an active debate in the scientific literature about whether fish can feel pain, and why infants were operated on without anesthetic until the 1990s. This means that an effective do-no-harm doctrine has to be uniquely negotiated for each discipline, through the careful examination of cost-benefit to all stakeholders involved. This means more work, but not necessarily less profits, as some analyses suggest that companies which focus on these questions outperform traditional corporations. But can something as simple as an oath actually produce behavioral changes in an industry?
This is where it gets trickier, because there aren't any real studies about the efficacy of the Hippocratic Oath. No one's really compared the behavior of doctors who have versus those who haven't taken it. What they have done, however, is systematically look at the behavior of professional ethicists, and the results aren't great. Ethicists are just as likely to litter, not call their parents, neglect to give blood, or talk loudly during a presentation. Furthermore, even our paragons of morality, from people like Gandhi to those who are willing to run into a burning building to save a stranger, don't seem to be able to maintain their ethical stance at all times. This ethical gap seems to result from the fact that ethics are often taught as a philosophical exploration rather than in the form of real-world problem solving. As people become more conversant with what defines a moral decision, they're able to cloak their bad decisions in philosophical language. Even worse, it seems like having gotten this kind of education, people are more likely to label themselves as ethical, even when that's not what's happening.
From the literature, it's clear that what's necessary for people to make ethical decisions goes far beyond an oath. They actually need to wrestle with the kind of real-life examples that are inevitably going to come up. Investment advisors are a great example of this. They have to pass a test called the Series 66 before getting a job in the field. In 2010, this test was rewritten to have less of a focus on ethical questions, from 80% down to 50% of the questions on the test. Researchers who were studying the impact of this found that those who took the old version of the test were just 1/4 as likely to commit misconduct as those who took the test that focused less on real-world ethical dilemmas. This shift likely has to do with the change in the way these traders saw themselves. At least, so says the moral philosopher, Alasdair MacIntyre, when he writes that the people can only answer the question of what am I to do if they can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. Studying how to make moral decisions as a prerequisite for entry led traders to cast themselves in what can be seen as a more ethical play. And it turns out that this kind of storytelling is woven into the most effective modes of moral education. Angela Duckworth's work on the development of self-control seems to show that behavioral changes require changing the narratives that prevent acting on whatever nascent but inconvenient desires one has. Like, let's say that you want to get people to eat more vegetables. It's way more effective for the cafeteria to hang a sign that says something like,
"People here eat lots of delicious vegetables,"
than it is to hang a sign that says,
"Eat vegetables."
An ethical education that actually works would then require changing the stories that people tell themselves. But can people really tell themselves a story where they're both ethical and profitable?
Getting this story right means we have to think hard about incentives. These are the motive powers that can create ethical oaths and an education that sticks. Our society so far has been so-so at this. See, we plan the obsolescence of everything from light bulbs to cell phones to bridges. We create technologies that are addictive and alienating, and we do develop and sell medicines that can kill the users. So how do we create structural changes in the way that we see business, profits, growth, and prosperity? The first order of business would be to develop debt-free education systems. Casting new graduates into the chum-filled waters of real life with an average of $30,000 debt on their backs is basically begging them to make bad decisions going forward. There's little room for ethical considerations when survival is on the table. The second approach would be to start messing around with how businesses are structured. Right now, the corporate boards are required to generate profits for their stockholders. Fair enough. In reaching for this goal, the corporation is not interested in being the only ethical actor in the field, since this would lead to an unfair competition, loss of profits, and eventual collapse of that company. Evading that kind of profit-death spiral can be as easy as staking a different organizational principle. Conventional corporations are bound by law to increase shareholder value, but benefit corporations follow a slightly different organizational principle, where the interests of the corporation go beyond profits. They also focus on making a positive impact on society, workers, and the environment. Unfortunately, as it stands, benefit corporations aren't incentivized financially, which could be solved by legislating tax breaks to offset losses incurred in the pursuit of public good.
A more direct way to an ethical corporate structure is through something called worker ownership, where the workers and the stockholders are actually the same entities. People usually dismiss this as being the domain of the anarchist bookstores and little bakeries, but worker-owned businesses include places like Ishmus Engineering, a robotics manufacturing company based out of Madison, Wisconsin, that pulls in $20 million a year, and the behemoth Mondragon Corporation, who posted 12 billion euros in revenue in 2015. It's almost as if customers can sense and know to support healthy enterprises. The reciprocal relationship between ethics, business, and public support means that even if you don't own a business, there's plenty you can accomplish by voting with your dollar. The more money we spend at ethical businesses, the more incentives there are for others to reconsider their organizational structure. Drop by drop, we actually can change the face of the earth.
So why don't all professions take some version of the Hippocratic Oath? Well, it's probably because oaths are idealistic, ineffective, and divorced from the conflict of real life. Seems like the answer is more to maintain a focus on real-world ethical education, where students are forced to wrestle with the same conundrums they're going to encounter in reality. But education isn't enough, since morals and ethics are often pitted against one another. Solving that problem requires incentivizing good business practices by changing the very structure of corporations, so they can remain profitable while integrating the public good. More and more companies are starting to realize how important that is, but it can't happen without us.
We all play a vital part in changing cultural norms by spending our money with the people who are actually taking care of the world. Knowing that everyone you deal with has practiced making the right choice over and over again will go a long way towards increasing mutual trust.
And at that point, I'd like to see everybody take the oath. After all, it would be a ceremonial culmination to a life of ethical contemplation, and that's an achievement worth celebrating.
That's all for today. If you like what we do, like, comment, subscribe, come join us on our Discord, and if you really like what we do, support us on Patreon. That's how we get it done.
See you next time.
Bye.